Ronnie Van Zant is hailed by many as the fearless and sometimes frightening leader of Lynyrd Skynyrd, one of the most iconic Southern rock bands ever to storm a stage. Tales of his short temper, his readiness to throw down at the slightest provocation, and his habit of performing barefoot have all converged into a legendary persona. Some say he predicted his own demise with chilling accuracy, while others believe that his rebellious spirit simply sped him towards an untimely end. Whatever the case, there's no denying that Van Zant embodied an electric mixture of raw ambition, unbreakable confidence, and almost eerie prophecy. He was, by many accounts, the scariest frontman in rock and roll, not just because of any gore or theatrics, but for the sheer force of personality that radiated through his every move. To fully understand Ronnie Van Zant's magnetic pull, one has to look far beyond the radio hits Free Bird and Sweet Home Alabama. The music is only half the story. His was a life marked by turbulence, from a tough upbringing that centered on grit and survival to a rebellious streak that propelled him and his bandmates into repeated clashes with authority. There was drama right from the start. Van Zant's father, Lacey, had been a prizefighter in his youth, and he passed his combative sensibilities on to all of his children. In a home environment where throwing punches was almost routine, Ronnie quickly learned that the loudest voice or the hardest swing often won the argument. It's little surprise he gravitated toward the raw energy of rock and roll. Yet there was a softer side to him too, one that loved fishing, traveling back roads with his father, and bonding over the music that drifted through dusty car radios. That duality defined him, tender enough to appreciate heartfelt melodies, and tough enough to enforce discipline among his fellow musicians. Friends and enemies alike learned to tread carefully around Ronnie. Indeed, fans might have viewed him as the unstoppable alpha wolf of Lynyrd Skynyrd, but bandmates sometimes found themselves in the crosshairs of his anger. He was known to erupt in violence over seemingly trivial matters: an untucked shirt, the wrong chord progression, or an ill-timed sip of wine during a show. Such stories would be enough on their own to fill the pages of rock history. But with Ronnie, there was always more. An ongoing feud with the Rolling Stones, rumored disputes with other artists, and that haunting plane crash that claimed the lives of Ronnie, several band members, and crew. He had insisted he wouldn't live to see the age of 30, an almost supernatural proclamation that tragically came true. Beyond the tragedy, though, is a story about the unstoppable will of a man who simply refused to bend or bow to anyone, not even to fate. The question, what if Ronnie Van Zant had lived, still lingers among Lynyrd Skynyrd fans. Some believe the band might have evolved into an even more unstoppable force. Others suggest that Van Zant's near-pathological intensity might have ended his rock and roll run sooner or later, no matter what path he took. Either way, the mark he left on Southern rock was indelible, and the controversies that swirled around him, whether it was his choice of stage attire, his use of certain symbols, or his refusal to follow the rules, continue to fascinate generations of fans worldwide. In the sections that follow, we'll explore the early years, from Jacksonvillian adolescence to the ironically named Hell House, where Lynyrd Skynyrd's sound first rumbled to life. We'll delve into the band's rebellious naming, the direct result of a high school dispute, and track their rapid ascent to stardom. Of course, no examination of Ronnie Van Zant's life would be complete without shining a light on the group's unstoppable hits, their unrelenting brawls, and the shocking final days leading to that deadly plane crash in 1977. And on the sidelines, there's the feud with Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, a bit of classic rock drama that only underscored how Ronnie couldn't stand being told what not to do. So brace yourself for a deep dive into the history, controversies, and wild adventures of Ronnie Van Zant. In a world where rock legends often burn bright and fade too soon, his story stands out for the grit and bravado that defined every step he took. This is the tale of a frontman so intense that even those who adored him sometimes kept their distance. It's the saga of a man who shaped an era, created a brand of Southern rock that still resonates, and left us all wondering what might have been if destiny had taken a different route. Ronald Wayne Ronnie Van Zant was born on January 15, 1948, in Jacksonville, Florida. Like many families of the region, the Van Zants were hard-working, grounded in blue-collar reality, and steeped in a certain Southern sensibility. Ronnie's father, Lacey, had been a truck driver for much of his adult life, but that was only part of his backstory. In his younger years, Lacey had made ends meet as a prizefighter. This wasn't a glitzy job. It was bruising work that taught him to withstand pain and never back down from a confrontation. Naturally, such lessons filtered down to Ronnie and his siblings. For Ronnie, childhood was hardly about indulging in fantasies or getting coddled by doting parents. It was more about learning how to stand your ground and throw a decent punch if life demanded it. According to some family friends, Lacey wanted to ensure his children could protect themselves in a rough neighborhood and an even rougher world. This philosophy wasn't about cruelty. It was a form of love, albeit a strict and unyielding one. Ronnie, the middle of three brothers, absorbed these lessons with vigor. Even as a kid, he displayed a rare self-confidence. Some might call it brazenness. From an early age, music captured Ronnie's interest. Although he was surrounded by siblings who also had varying levels of musical ability, there seemed to be something special about the way Ronnie listened to songs on the car radio. He picked up nuances in the rhythms and lyrics that others might ignore, humming or singing along until he understood every note by heart. Trips in Lacey's truck, with the radio blasting everything from country tunes to early rock numbers, were in many ways Ronnie's first musical classroom. As he approached his teenage years, Ronnie began experimenting with forming his own bands. This was the mid-1960s, a time when countless young Americans were trying their hand at rock and roll, inspired by the British invasion and the rebellious spirit that came with it. Ronnie jumped into the fray, initially founding a group modestly called Us, which, ironically, disbanded almost as soon as it began. Undeterred, Ronnie took this as a learning experience, discovering in the process that he much preferred the role of lead singer over anything else. He had a voice that demanded attention, and he had no qualms about pushing others to meet his high expectations. Around this time, he also played baseball, potentially with enough talent to go somewhere if he'd chosen a different path. But music was the stronger pull, an outlet for the restless energy that always surged through him. While most teenagers in Jacksonville tried to navigate high school dances and occasional weekend gigs, Ronnie wanted something bigger. He wanted to make a real name for himself, and if it meant skipping school or bending rules, so be it. His ambitions finally started to gain momentum when he hooked up with Bob Burns, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, and Larry Junstrom. This group, initially called My Backyard, spent long hours practicing whenever they weren't in class, or, more often than not, when they should have been in class. They quickly realized they had something special. Despite band members being as young as 13, they played with the spirit of seasoned bluesmen who'd been jamming for a lifetime. No one yet recognized them as Lynyrd Skynyrd, the band that would come to define Southern rock. But the seeds were planted. An energetic lead vocalist, unafraid of confrontation. A set of musicians passionate about forging a unique sound, and a rebellious streak that would soon set them apart from every other teen band in Florida. More than anything else, Ronnie's early years illustrate the paradox of his persona. Shaped by a father's tough love, tempered in a challenging environment, and brimming with a musical passion that refused to remain small. As the 1960s wore on, the group that would eventually become Lynyrd Skynyrd began to coalesce around Ronnie's leadership style. It was a style built on disciplined repetition, rehearsing the same riff or drum fill until it was flawless, and unfiltered honesty. If someone played a bad note, Ronnie let them know. If they needed to practice a solo 20 times in a row, they did it. This mixture of raw determination and borderline intimidation became a hallmark of Ronnie's approach. He wanted to push his bandmates to greatness, and he wasn't afraid to use fear or force to get there. By the decade's end, Ronnie was evolving from a neighborhood troublemaker into a fledgling rock star with serious goals. With each passing jam session, he moved one step closer to the identity that would soon capture the American music scene's attention. Yet for all his success on local stages, he was still just a young man with big dreams. Not yet the towering figure who would tangle with Mick Jagger or predict his own death with uncanny certainty. But in typical Ronnie fashion, he was about to shift things into high gear. The band needed a more permanent space to practice without the cops being called. Their rebellious instincts needed a better outlet than the occasional teenage dispute. High school rules were too restrictive, and the local neighborhood was tired of hearing them blare electric guitars at all hours. Something had to change, and as we'll see in the next section, Ronnie and his bandmates found the perfect hideaway for their musical metamorphosis, a place they'd come to call Hell House. In the earliest days of what would later become Lynyrd Skynyrd, the constant struggle to find a rehearsal space was a thorn in the side of every member. Parents complained about the racket shaking their walls, neighbors called the cops to shut them down, and the band hopped from one house to another in search of a safe haven for their ear-splitting jam sessions. The solution arrived in the form of a dilapidated, unassuming building on a farm at the outskirts of Jacksonville, a place far enough from residential areas that no one would care how loud they got. It was hot, cramped, and isolated, and they quickly dubbed it Hell House. The nickname was more than just a snarky comment about the blazing Florida sun and non-existent air conditioning. Hell House felt like its own reality. The structure was old, the roof was questionable, and the entire place felt like it could collapse if you jumped too hard. Yet this space turned out to be the ideal breeding ground for a raw, unfiltered style of rock music. Here, the group could turn their amplifiers all the way up, refine their licks, and let Ronnie's vocals rip through the stale air without fear of any noise complaint knocking at the door. The environment was as tough as their approach. Temperatures regularly climbed above 90 degrees, turning each session into a sweaty, grueling ordeal. But in Ronnie's eyes, that was perfect. If they could conquer these conditions, any stage in the world would be easy. The band practiced for hours on end, hammering out original tunes and perfecting cover songs. Ronnie would sometimes push them so far that members were left exhausted, almost to the point of collapse. But he wasn't just a tyrant barking orders. He participated fully, singing until his voice gave out, forging a sense of unity amid the chaos. In these marathon rehearsals, the band also experimented with their identity. They cycled through names, Wildcats, Conqueror Worm, The Pretty Ones, and more, none of which quite captured their essence. Throughout these transformations, Ronnie remained the anchor. Everyone understood that his leadership, for better or worse, was the glue. Guitarist Gary Rossington later recalled how Ronnie drove them to tighten their sound. If a guitar player was off by even a beat, they'd rework the entire piece until it clicked. It was an approach that mirrored Ronnie's childhood lessons. Practice your punches until you can do them in your sleep. Never let your guard down. Show no weakness. Life in Hell House wasn't just about music, though. It was also about bonding in an environment that forced them to rely on each other. If somebody forgot water or food, everyone shared. If a piece of equipment broke, they'd pool their funds to fix it. They built an unshakable camaraderie, though it was a camaraderie often tempered by arguments and near-physical altercations. The Florida heat could boil tempers, and Ronnie was known to get in your face if he felt you weren't giving 100%. It was during these Hell House sessions that the group's distinct brand of Southern rock truly began to take shape. While they admired and learned from the British invasion bands, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Yardbirds, they also had local influences in country, blues, and boogie. This combination molded their aesthetic into something more than just garage rock. Their riffs had an earthy, swampy vibe, reflecting the marshes and backroads of Florida. Ronnie's lyrics, influenced by everything from heartbreak to local pride, added a layer of authenticity that fans would come to cherish. They landed small gigs under different names, sometimes performing at local dances or small clubs. Payment often came in the form of gas money or free drinks, hardly the glamorous route to stardom, but it was enough to keep them going. Ronnie, for his part, never complained about the meager pay. He saw every gig as a chance to refine their set, to develop stage presence, and to test how crowds reacted to new material. If a particular riff fell flat, he'd go back to Hell House and demand they restructure the arrangement. While Hell House provided a cocoon for these formative experiences, it also symbolized a deeper ethos. The members were outsiders, misfits in the eyes of more conventional people. The band had outgrown the typical teenage clique structure. They had something bigger on their minds. They wanted to carve a permanent place in the rock scene. They wanted to do it on their own terms, unbothered by the noise complaints, dress codes, and authority figures that had plagued them in school. Yet, ironically, school was still about to play a massive role in shaping their ultimate identity. As the group toiled under the scorching heat of their remote sanctuary, each day they returned to mainstream society reminded them just how at odds they were with the establishment. Rules about hair length and personal presentation felt suffocating, especially for Ronnie, who treasured his long, flowing locks as a badge of rock rebellion. Little did they know that these frustrations would soon lead them to the name that would forever change their lives: Lynyrd Skynyrd. But that story starts with a stubborn gym teacher and a petty high school rule that lit the spark of rebellious creativity in Ronnie's mind. In Hell House, the seeds of that rebellion were nurtured daily. The band's sound grew more aggressive, more confident, and more polished. Every chord progression was hammered into place with near-military discipline. Discipline that, ironically, blossomed in a place named for its punishing conditions. The atmosphere was intense, but it worked. By the time they finally left Hell House each day, instruments in tow, they felt a step closer to that intangible greatness they all believed in. However, the daily battles and small victories in that rickety shack were mere preludes to the bigger battles awaiting them. Ronnie Van Zant's stormy relationship with authority didn't begin when he was famous. It took root in high school hallways, under the fluorescent glare of teachers who saw him and his bandmates as troublemakers. The most significant figure in this early struggle was none other than a gym teacher named Lynyrd Skynyrd, an individual who had no idea he was about to become part of rock history. In Jacksonville's Robert E. Lee High School, strict dress codes were common, particularly concerning hair length. For Ronnie, who saw his hairstyle as a form of self-expression, being forced to cut his hair or keep it off his collar felt like the ultimate betrayal of freedom. To comply just enough to avoid immediate punishment, Ronnie used Vaseline to slick his hair back so it wouldn't rest on his collar. This ruse might have worked on most teachers, but Skinner was determined to enforce the rules. He'd patrol the showers after gym class, checking on the boys' wet hair to see if it hung past their collars. Each violation earned Ronnie a trip to the principal's office and, sooner or later, suspension. This ongoing battle with Lynyrd Skynyrd escalated further when the band's guitarist Gary Rossington decided he'd had enough. Legend has it that Rossington made an obscene gesture at the teacher before leaving school for good. Expulsion, suspension, none of it mattered anymore because the bandmates were united in their conviction that they shouldn't have to conform to a set of appearance norms that stifled their creativity. Their rebellious streak was about more than hair length. It was about defying the entire establishment that told them how to look, act, and think. One night at the Forest Inn, where the group, still operating under a hodgepodge of different names, was performing to a crowd packed with current and former students of that very high school, Ronnie seized the moment. He announced on stage that they were rechristening themselves Lynyrd Skynyrd, in pointed reference to the teacher who'd caused them so much trouble. It was a cheeky yet defiant move, especially since they tweaked the spelling to avoid any direct legal or personal conflict. They might have been dropping out of school or getting suspended, but they were turning the situation into part of their identity, flipping the script from powerless students to empowered, rebellious rockers. This new name was more than just a jab at a strict teacher. It became the band's rallying cry. It symbolized their transition from teenage miscreants into a serious musical entity poised for bigger things. The irony of naming themselves after an authority figure who'd tried to stifle their freedom couldn't have been more potent. For Ronnie, it was both a stroke of genius and a middle finger to the institutions that had tried to contain him. The rebellious air that had been building during the Hell House days now had a sharp, witty focal point. Despite how flippant it might have seemed, adopting the name Lynyrd Skynyrd came at a time when the band's musical evolution was on an upward trajectory. They'd grown tight through countless hours of rehearsal in brutal heat. They'd begun developing signature riffs and a stage presence that was both raw and magnetic. With a stable identity, at least in terms of branding, they could now tackle bigger gigs, attract more fans, and start thinking seriously about recording opportunities. Of course, the high school fiasco also fed into the group's local reputation. Word spread around Jacksonville that there was this scrappy band of long-haired rebels who had the gall to name themselves after the teacher who never missed a chance to discipline them. Other students, many of whom chafed at the same rules, felt a surge of vicarious satisfaction. Those who had butted heads with the administration for far milder infractions found solace in knowing that Ronnie and his crew were out there, spurning the system in a far more dramatic fashion. That said, naming themselves after Lynyrd Skynyrd wasn't all fun and games. They had effectively tied their brand to a comedic poke at a real individual, which risked overshadowing the seriousness of their music if they weren't careful. But Ronnie, as was his style, didn't overthink it. To him, the best possible band name was the one that made the biggest statement. He didn't care about whether it would be looked upon as silly or unprofessional. He cared about the spark of rebellious energy it would ignite in fans. Soon, Lynyrd Skynyrd was playing bigger shows, building a name that was both strange and instantly memorable. Audiences would ask, "Who's Lynyrd Skynyrd?" And, more often than not, the band's story of high school defiance came out as a badge of honor. It gave them an edge that their local competitors lacked, an intriguing tale that could be told in the span of a few short sentences. Indeed, that rebellious streak would continue to define them for years to come, influencing everything from the way they performed on stage to the manner in which they negotiated with record labels. By the early 1970s, as Lynyrd Skynyrd readied themselves for the next big leap, the legacy of Lynyrd Skynyrd was already cemented within the group's lore. Their name was both a testament to the petty injustices they faced in school and an early sign of the audacity that would carry them forward. More than that, it was a public declaration. They weren't going to play by the rules, not even if it meant butting heads with the biggest names in rock. That unwavering confidence would serve them well as they embarked on a journey that would eventually bring them face to face with figures like Mick Jagger, and, in turn, cement Ronnie Van Zant's status as one of the scariest frontmen in rock history. As Lynyrd Skynyrd began to gather steam, Ronnie Van Zant found himself juggling the chaos of a burgeoning rock career with the reality of adult responsibilities. He was, after all, more than just a high school dropout and rebel musician. He was also a husband, twice over, and a father. These personal ties often get overshadowed by the band's on-stage exploits and near-mythical stories of Ronnie's temper, yet they were integral to his life and shaped many of his decisions. In the mid-1960s, Ronnie met Nadine Insko. She wasn't directly involved in the music scene in the way many might imagine a rock star's girlfriend to be, but she did share in the smaller local excitement of Lynyrd Skynyrd's earliest days. By 1967, the two were married. Within a few years, they welcomed a daughter, Tammy, into the world. During this period, Ronnie's life balanced precariously between the urgent demands of a band that was starting to find its groove and the responsibilities of a family man. To make ends meet, and possibly to appease relatives concerned about his future, Ronnie worked briefly at his brother-in-law's auto parts store. It was a far cry from the smoky stages and electric guitars that had come to define him. According to various anecdotes, Ronnie did an honest day's work, but never truly embraced the 9-to-5 routine. He might have clocked in and stocked shelves, but deep down, he was itching to get back to Hell House or any stage that would have him. Music was not just a passion, it was an obsession. The tension between his domestic life and his rock and roll aspirations soon became impossible to ignore. By 1969, Ronnie and Nadine parted ways. Some sources say the strain of an erratic schedule, countless late-night gigs and uncertain financial prospects took its toll on the marriage. Others hint that Ronnie simply wasn't cut out for the conventional life that Nadine may have wanted. Whatever the precise reasons, the result was a divorce that put an end to one chapter of his life but opened the door to another. Around this time, he met Judy Seymour, who would become his second wife. Ronnie's relationship with Judy seemed to align more closely with his rock lifestyle. She was aware of what it meant to be involved with a musician on the rise, and she accepted that the band would always be his main focus. They eventually married and had a daughter, Melody. During this phase, Lynyrd Skynyrd was pushing harder than ever to secure a record deal. The group did sign a contract with Capricorn Records at one point, but incredibly, Ronnie decided to walk away from it. The precise motivations behind turning down that record deal remain a point of debate. Some say he felt the offer wasn't good enough financially, while others claim he wanted more artistic freedom than Capricorn was willing to allow. What's clear is that Ronnie wasn't afraid of bold moves. Walking away from a record contract might have spelled doom for some fledgling bands, but Ronnie had faith in Lynyrd Skynyrd's potential. He believed a bigger, better deal would come along. And, as fate would have it, MCA Records eventually offered the band a contract that launched them into the mainstream. This outcome validated Ronnie's gamble, reinforcing his reputation as a confident risk-taker. Despite the outward chaos of his personal life, Ronnie maintained strong ties with his parents and siblings. Lacey, his father, had guided Ronnie with tough love. And Ronnie never forgot those lessons. Even when the band started touring more extensively, Ronnie would check in with his family back home. They represented a grounding force that reminded him of who he was before the fame. His brothers, Donnie and Johnny, also pursued music careers. Donnie co-founded .38 Special, and Johnny would later take Ronnie's place as the lead vocalist of Lynyrd Skynyrd after the plane crash. This family dynamic underscores that, despite all the rebelliousness, there was a close-knit aspect to the Van Zant clan. While marriage and fatherhood might not have stifled Ronnie's wild impulses, they certainly didn't dampen his temper or thirst for a good fight. They did show a side of him that craved some semblance of stability. It's possible that, beneath the swagger and tough guy persona, he wanted a place to call home, a family who would support him no matter what. Yet this desire clashed with the relentless pace of a rising rock band, forcing him to make choices that often placed music first, and domestic peace second. Ultimately, this tug-of-war between normal life and rock stardom shaped Ronnie into an even more complex figure. He had responsibilities, but he was also committed to forging a legendary path with Lynyrd Skynyrd. That friction lent an edge to his performances, a raw tension that fans could sense. It's one thing to be a young single musician with no ties. It's quite another to navigate the unpredictability of show business while juggling marital commitments and parenthood. In Ronnie's case, it meant living a double life of sorts. The loving father at home who, once on stage, transformed into a brash, take-no-prisoners frontman, prone to bar brawls and backstage scuffles. This phase of Ronnie's life also included the seeds of what would become some of Lynyrd Skynyrd's most impactful songs. As he wrestled with the realities of love, heartbreak, and fatherhood, he poured those emotions into lyrics that spoke of hardship and resilience, attributes that would become cornerstones of Southern rock. But the biggest leap was just around the corner. With the finalization of their MCA deal and the release of their debut album, Lynyrd Skynyrd were about to step into a national spotlight. All the tensions, triumphs, and heartbreak that Ronnie had experienced thus far would feed into the sound that took the rock world by storm. And while the band's music soared on the charts, the man at the microphone continued to build a reputation as an unpredictable, formidable presence, both on stage and off. By the early 1970s, Lynyrd Skynyrd had refined their craft to a point where they were ready to share their music with the world, or at least with anyone who would listen. Ronnie Van Zant's gut instinct that a better deal than the one offered by Capricorn Records would materialize proved correct in 1973 when MCA Records came calling. This opportunity arrived after years of performing in dingy bars, traveling from one small gig to the next, and honing a distinctive style that fused country balladry with the raw energy of rock. For Ronnie, signing with MCA meant validation and a new level of creative freedom. The subsequent release of the band's debut album, pronounced Lynyrd Skynyrd, served as their official introduction to mainstream rock audiences. The album wasted no time in making an impact, featuring some of their earliest hits that remain fan favorites to this day. Tracks like Gimme 3 Steps and Tuesday's Gone resonated with listeners, but the standout was undoubtedly Free Bird. Clocking in at over 9 minutes, Free Bird contained all the elements of Lynyrd Skynyrd's signature style: dual and sometimes triple lead guitars, lyrics that captured a spirit of restless wanderlust, and a soaring finale that became a monumental live staple. Legend has it that Ronnie Van Zant composed the lyrics for Free Bird in mere minutes, though that story might have been a slight exaggeration. Even if it wasn't, his rapid-fire approach to songwriting reflected his gut-level intensity. He poured emotion directly onto the page without overthinking every syllable. The resulting track is one of rock's most iconic anthems, frequently played as a show closer in concerts. Live renditions could last upwards of 14 minutes, as the band indulged in extended guitar solos that thrilled audiences. Famously, at a 1976 performance immortalized on the album One More from the Road, Ronnie asked the crowd what they wanted to hear, and the echoing request was "Free Bird." The band launched into a 14-minute version, cementing the song as the pinnacle of Lynyrd Skynyrd's live presence. This era also saw the rise of the "Free Bird" chant, a phenomenon that transcended Lynyrd Skynyrd's own shows. Fans of other bands, from Bob Dylan to Nirvana, would often shout for "Free Bird" when prompted for requests. It became a wry, good-natured tradition that highlighted Lynyrd Skynyrd's cultural influence. In this sense, Ronnie Van Zant's songwriting had broken through the confines of a single band's discography and entered the broader pop culture consciousness. For a barefoot, brawl-ready singer from Jacksonville, that was no small feat. The band's sound, often labeled Southern rock, was a point of some debate among its members. Ronnie sometimes downplayed the Southern label, insisting that they drew just as much from the British invasion as they did from country and blues. In truth, Lynyrd Skynyrd blended genres fluidly. Sure, they might have used imagery reminiscent of Southern pride, but their musical influences were a melting pot, including the Rolling Stones, the Beatles, Clapton-era blues, and the swampy twang of American roots music. All these ingredients set them apart from other bands of the era, making Lynyrd Skynyrd truly unique. Despite the success and acclaim, Ronnie's personal life and the band's internal dynamics were as tumultuous as ever. Their newfound fame brought more shows, heavier touring schedules, and higher stakes. Ronnie, always one to demand the best from himself and others, could become volatile at the slightest mistake. Stories abound of him punching bandmates on stage if they stepped out of line. One well-documented instance involved him smacking a colleague who was drinking wine during a set. To Ronnie, such an act showed disrespect to the audience and the music. For outsiders, it was confirmation that he was indeed the scariest frontman in rock, someone who wouldn't hesitate to resort to physical confrontation if he felt the moment called for it. At the same time, the band reveled in a sort of fraternal chaos. They were known to drink heavily, get into bar fights, and occasionally destroy dressing rooms. Their press agent apparently viewed these exploits not as public relations disasters, but as part of the band's gritty mystique. In a rock landscape that prized authenticity and edge, Lynyrd Skynyrd's rowdy behavior earned them both fans and critics. To be fair, some of that reckless energy translated into phenomenal live shows, where the tension on stage crackled into the music itself, mesmerizing the crowds. Free Bird was more than just a hit single. It was a statement. It encapsulated the attitude of the band and the restlessness of Ronnie Van Zant's own soul. He often claimed that the bird symbolized freedom from constraints, whether those constraints were social expectations, record label demands, or even personal demons. Of course, the irony is that Ronnie's life at times seemed anything but free. He was bound by a fierce temper and a series of personal obligations. Yet Free Bird, there was no denying the sense of liberation it offered him. On stage, barefoot, belting out lines about wanting to be unshackled from life's limitations, Ronnie gave voice to an entire generation of fans who felt similarly restricted. This contradiction, yearning for freedom while wrestling with personal strife, defined Ronnie's persona and fueled the emotional depth of Lynyrd Skynyrd's music. The band continued to climb the charts, releasing more successful albums, including Second Helping, 1974, which featured the massive hit Sweet Home Alabama, and Nothin' Fancy, 1975, which solidified their status as a formidable force in rock. Through it all, Free Bird remained the anthem that signified both the band's achievements and the intense frontman who helmed it all. By 1976, Ronnie and his bandmates had 5 albums under their belt, a widespread fan base, and a reputation that both intrigued and intimidated. The next step would either cement their place as rock legends or push them over the edge. Little did anyone know that fate had already set in motion events that would alter the course of Lynyrd Skynyrd forever. And through it all, Ronnie Van Zant's premonitions about his own mortality began to loom larger, a haunting undercurrent that would soon collide with the band's unstoppable momentum. By the mid-1970s, the Lynyrd Skynyrd train was roaring down the tracks at full speed, fueled by chart-topping hits and raucous live shows. Yet the pressures of fame and the band's penchant for living on the edge led to a series of mishaps that tested Ronnie Van Zant's leadership and temper. If they weren't brawling with each other or outsiders, they were sliding deeper into the vices that often accompany a rock star lifestyle: heavy drinking, substance experimentation, and risky behavior that sometimes spilled onto the highways. One of the most significant wake-up calls for the band came in 1976, when not one, but 2 devastating car accidents shook Lynyrd Skynyrd's lineup. Guitarist Alan Collins, under the influence of alcohol, crashed into another vehicle, hurling it across a parking lot. Shortly thereafter, Gary Rossington, also reportedly inebriated, fell asleep at the wheel of his brand-new car. The resulting crash was brutal, knocking down a telephone pole, splitting an oak tree, and causing massive property damage to a nearby home. Rossington's injuries were serious enough to require the band to cancel scheduled tour dates. But if fans expected any sympathy from Ronnie Van Zant, they were sorely mistaken. Ronnie was livid at how these accidents jeopardized the band's momentum. In a move that shocked some, he fined both Collins and Rossington $5,000 each. From an outsider's perspective, this might have seemed draconian, but Ronnie took pride in the band's professionalism, at least when it came to delivering top-tier performances. Any threat to that standard, be it drunken driving or sloppy stage antics, was met with swift and harsh consequences. This dynamic highlighted just how complicated Ronnie's role had become. He was the lead singer and creative force, but also a quasi-enforcer who believed in discipline. In interviews, some band members admitted they lived in a constant mix of camaraderie and fear.
4 teeth, and so I had to have a 4-piece bridge built.
Mine was arrested several times.
He liked to get in trouble.
Ronnie could be a warm, supportive presence one moment, offering to buy a friend lunch or help them with personal issues, only to flip into a rage if that same friend let him down musically or morally.
And after it was done that day, Ronnie looked at me and he goes, "There's our rambling man."
Meanwhile, legal troubles mounted for Ronnie himself. His fondness for a good fight hadn't faded. Rumor has it that by 1976, he had been arrested more than a dozen times. Bar fights, hotel room trashing, scuffles with other musicians — it was all part of the chaotic tapestry that defined Lynyrd Skynyrd's mythos. Press agents often played up these incidents, seeing them as fuel for the rebellious image fans found irresistible. Indeed, some fans reveled in hearing that the band was just as wild off stage as on. That raw authenticity was a selling point in an industry saturated with acts more interested in showy glam than honest grit. But even as they navigated these storms, Lynyrd Skynyrd continued to produce new music. Gimme Back My Bullets, 1976, and Street Survivors, 1977, showcased their evolving sound. Street Survivors, in particular, introduced guitarist Steve Gaines, who added a fresh dynamic to the group. Tracks like What's Your Name and That Smell pointed to the band's ability to address their own frailties, especially That Smell, a dark commentary on substance abuse. That Smell felt like a cautionary tale, a reflection of the band's own reckless living. Lines about "Oak tree, you're in my way" seem to be a direct reference to Rossington's crash. Ronnie's lyrics laid bare the dangers lurking behind their lifestyle. This blend of success, caution, and chaos came to define Lynyrd Skynyrd's mid-70s trajectory. They were riding high, but always teetering on the brink of disaster. Behind the scenes, Ronnie's eerie predictions about his own mortality began to feel more ominous. Family members and close friends recalled him saying he wouldn't make it to 30. These remarks, repeated often, seemed less like passing jokes and more like a genuine conviction. Some chalked it up to the rock star mentality that romanticized early death. Others believed Ronnie had inherited a sort of second sight from his father's side of the family. In the swirl of superstition and Southern folklore, the idea that Ronnie might meet an untimely end carried a certain weight. As if foreshadowing the tragedy to come, Lynyrd Skynyrd's album cover for Street Survivors depicted the band standing amid flames, an image that would become chillingly prophetic. The internal strife, the accidents, and the sense of impending doom were all building toward a crescendo. Yet in typical rock and roll fashion, the band pressed on, launching a tour to promote the new record and continuing to push the boundaries of their live performances. In this volatile atmosphere, Ronnie remained the driving force who kept everything glued together, at least on stage. The deeper the band sank into chaos, the more Ronnie demanded perfection in their music. He believed that as long as they delivered electrifying shows and compelling songs, they could transcend the turmoil of their personal lives. But fate had other plans. The final events that would define Ronnie's life and forever alter the course of Lynyrd Skynyrd were just around the corner. As 1977 rolled on, Lynyrd Skynyrd had every reason to celebrate. Their latest album, Street Survivors, was fresh on the market and garnering positive reviews. Fans were excited about the band's tour, eager to see how the new material would sound live. Unbeknownst to everyone, though, the era of Ronnie Van Zant was on the verge of a dramatic and heartbreaking end, one that would seemingly validate his years of grim prophecy about not living past 30. On October 20th, 1977, the band boarded a Convair CV-240 plane in South Carolina, bound for Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where they were scheduled to perform next. The flight manifest included band members, tour managers, and crew, all accustomed to the demands of touring. Although the plane was older, the group had used it before, and any concerns about its condition seemed overshadowed by the momentum of the tour. However, trouble struck partway through the flight. Fuel complications arose, and the pilots realized too late that they didn't have enough to safely reach their destination. Some accounts describe a frantic scene in the cabin, passengers buckling in for a crash landing, passing worried glances, praying for a miracle. According to multiple survivors, the pilot's voice came over the intercom, instructing everyone to brace. The plane crashed in a forest near Gillsburg, Mississippi, clipping trees before slamming to the ground in a catastrophic impact. Ronnie Van Zant, seated near the front, was killed instantly when his head struck part interior. He was 29, just shy of his 30th birthday, matching the very timeline he had always warned about. Other casualties included guitarist Steve Gaines and his sister, backing vocalist Cassie Gaines, along with band road manager Dean Kilpatrick and the two pilots. Several others sustained grievous injuries, including drummer Artemis Pyle, guitarist Alan Collins, and guitarist Gary Rossington. The crash site, deep in a wooded area, made rescue operations difficult. Local residents rushed to the scene to help, but the devastation was overwhelming. The wreck left a permanent scar on the Lynyrd Skynyrd legacy and on the rock world at large. The news of the crash rippled through fans and the music industry. One can only imagine the shock felt by those who had heard Ronnie speak so often of dying young. Conspiracy theories swirled. Was the plane truly out of fuel? Or was there a mechanical failure? Was Ronnie's death some kind of fated event, as he'd always believed? In the immediate aftermath, those close to him could only grieve and recall his haunting predictions. His father, Lacey, would later remark that Ronnie often spoke of his own demise as if it were written in the stars, believing with unshakable certainty that he wouldn't see 30. The tragedy of the plane crash struck at the height of Lynyrd Skynyrd's success. They had reached a level of stardom where their next moves could have elevated them even further. Instead, the band was thrown into chaos. Surviving members faced months, if not years, of rehabilitation, not just physically, but also psychologically. The knowledge that Ronnie, Steve, and Cassie were gone weighed heavily on them, leaving an unfillable void in their lineup and their hearts. In the wake of the crash, Street Survivors took on an eerie significance. The album cover, featuring the group amid flames, was pulled from shelves and replaced out of respect for the deceased. Meanwhile, fans around the world mourned Ronnie's passing, holding memorials and playing Lynyrd Skynyrd's songs in tribute. The funeral services for the lost band members were emotionally charged, with some attendees so overwhelmed they literally collapsed in grief. Ronnie was laid to rest wearing his beloved black hat, accompanied by the fishing pole he cherished. Yet even in death, Ronnie Van Zant's story remained bizarrely tumultuous. In June 2000, vandals desecrated his tomb, prompting the family to relocate his remains to an undisclosed location for safekeeping. It seemed as though rest would not come easily for the scariest frontman in rock and roll, even in the afterlife. Ronnie's wife, Judy, and other surviving family members faced the difficult question of how to honor his legacy. The band effectively disbanded in the crash's aftermath, though various members would reunite a decade later under the Lynyrd Skynyrd name, with Ronnie's younger brother Johnny stepping in as lead vocalist. It was a continuation of sorts, but everyone knew that the original spirit, the uncontainable fury, the visionary leadership, had ended in that Mississippi swamp. Still, Ronnie's influence reverberates today. His fiercely independent, often combative stance inspired generations of rock musicians who saw in him the epitome of a frontman who answered to no one. And even though his life was tragically cut short, the music he helped create has proven timeless. Freebird continues to echo through stadiums and local bars alike. Sweet Home Alabama remains an anthem for Southern pride, and even spawns controversies over its meaning. Ronnie's legend endures in every hoarse-voiced singer who tries to embody the same raw passion. The plane crash also solidified Lynyrd Skynyrd's place in the pantheon of rock tragedies, alongside the losses of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and other iconic figures who met untimely ends while in flight. Each time the anniversary rolls around, fans revisit the details of that day, the warnings that went unheeded, and the stubborn sense of destiny that Ronnie seemed to carry. His death was sudden, abrupt, but in a way, it fit the frenetic nature of his life. He roared into the world of rock, made his mark, and exited as dramatically as he had lived. Amid the maelstrom of Ronnie Van Zant's short life, one of the most intriguing episodes involves a tense standoff with none other than Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. This dust-up occurred when Lynyrd Skynyrd opened for the Stones at the Knebworth Festival in 1976, a gig that should have been a crowning achievement, a chance to play before a massive audience and rub elbows with rock royalty. Instead, it turned into another chapter in Ronnie's legacy of defiance. The stage at Knebworth was designed to look like the Rolling Stones' famous tongue and lips logo, an iconic piece of rock imagery. Prior to the show, Mick Jagger reportedly laid down one strict rule for Lynyrd Skynyrd: they were not to perform on the tongue portion of the stage. It was reserved for the Stones, an important part of their stage identity. But telling Ronnie Van Zant he couldn't do something was like lighting a fuse. Not only did Ronnie ignore the request, he led the band directly onto the tongue for their performance of Free Bird. The crowd ate it up. For many fans, it was a moment of pure rock rebellion that overshadowed even the Stones themselves. Needless to say, Mick Jagger and his entourage were furious. The rumor goes that Ronnie's stunt effectively destroyed any chance of Lynyrd Skynyrd performing with the Rolling Stones in the future. To Ronnie, though, the act was about something bigger than just stirring trouble. It was about asserting that Lynyrd Skynyrd deserved the same respect as any legendary band, that they didn't come all that way to be treated as second-class performers. Whether you view it as audacious or foolhardy, the incident left an indelible mark on the band's reputation as fierce nonconformists. For fans, this showdown with the Stones became part of the same rebellious mystique that fueled stories of bar fights and backstage brawls. Ronnie's refusal to yield was so in line with his personality that many who heard the tale simply shrugged. Of course, Ronnie did that. Another detail that surfaced in various accounts: sometimes Ronnie wore a shirt during performances that read, "Who the fucks are the Rolling Stones?" further inflaming a rivalry that might otherwise have fizzled into a forgotten footnote. True or apocryphal, such stories paint a vivid picture of a man who saw no reason to bow down to bigger names or older traditions. Yet, like so many aspects of Ronnie's life, the feud with the Stones left a sense of unfinished business. Had he lived longer, one wonders whether the two bands might have reconciled, possibly even collaborated. The Southern blues roots that Lynyrd Skynyrd shared with the Stones could have made for an intriguing joint performance, but Ronnie's passing cut short any chance of that. Instead, the story remains an example of how he refused to be marginalized, even by giants of the genre. It also speaks to the broader tension between Lynyrd Skynyrd's ethos and the mainstream rock establishment. The Stones were akin to rock royalty. Ronnie and his band were the scrappy newcomers from the American South who brought a raw, unpolished intensity. If nothing else, the standoff at Knebworth symbolized the friction between two different brands of rock swagger: Mick Jagger's polished confidence versus Ronnie Van Zant's bare-knuckle grit. And while Jagger may have had the backing of an industry that revered the Stones, Ronnie's willingness to break the rules endeared him even more to fans who appreciated a no-holds-barred approach to performance. Ironically, the Stones themselves had built a reputation on rebellion in the 1960s, defying norms and pushing boundaries. But by 1976, they had become so successful that they could afford to exert control over their opening acts. Ronnie, who probably admired the Stones' earlier rebelliousness, may have felt betrayed by this new veneer of rock elitism. Rather than submit, he made a show of resistance, one that still resonates decades later as a highlight in Lynyrd Skynyrd folklore. With his passing in 1977, Ronnie Van Zant left an entire list of what-ifs. What if Lynyrd Skynyrd had gone on to record multiple more albums with him at the helm? What if they had mended fences with the Stones or collaborated with other rock icons? What if Ronnie's predictions of his early death had turned out to be false, allowing him to mellow with age and become a guiding elder statesman of Southern rock? These questions can never be answered, of course. But the conflict at Knebworth, small as it might seem in the grand timeline of Ronnie's life, captured the essence of his character. Impulsive, fiercely independent, and utterly unafraid of stepping on toes, be they the toes of high school gym teachers or international superstars like the Stones. In the end, Lynyrd Skynyrd never did share a stage with Mick Jagger's group again. But the legacy of that one night remains. It stands as a reminder of Ronnie's unstoppable will, the same will that led him to form a band named after a teacher who enforced hair-length rules. The same will that drove him to fine his bandmates for crashing cars and risk losing a record deal to maintain his artistic principles. The same will that refused to yield to any obstacles, even if it meant going down in a blaze of glory. And that is what makes Ronnie Van Zant, for many, the single most formidable presence in Southern rock's storied history. Ronnie Van Zant lived and died by a simple credo: never compromise who you are for anyone. That mantra fueled his meteoric rise from a scrappy Jacksonville upbringing to the pinnacle of American rock. It also propelled him into countless fights, occasionally sabotaging his own relationships and, ironically, escalating the dangers he faced on and off stage. Yet the man behind the music was far more complex than the sum of his controversies. He was a deeply passionate soul who believed in family, whether it meant the kin he grew up with or the bandmates he considered brothers. He had a unique vision for Lynyrd Skynyrd, weaving diverse musical influences into what became known as the quintessential Southern rock sound. Through it all, Ronnie displayed an almost supernatural resolve, practicing tirelessly in Hell House, defying a gym teacher's demands by naming the band Lynyrd Skynyrd, and going toe-to-toe with Mick Jagger over a piece of iconic stage design. This relentless spirit served him well as the band soared through the charts, with hits like Free Bird and Sweet Home Alabama, songs that remain cultural touchstones even decades after their release. But for every success story, there was an accompanying saga of internal strife, near mythical brawls, and devastating losses, culminating in the plane crash that ended his life at 29, as he had grimly predicted. Ronnie's legacy endures in the generations of fans who still echo the call for Free Bird at concerts worldwide, a permanent nod to the timeless, electrifying energy he brought to every performance. It resonates in the family ties that kept Lynyrd Skynyrd going long after his death, with younger brother Johnny Van Zant stepping up to fill the role Ronnie left vacant. It lives on in the rebellious hearts of aspiring musicians who see in Ronnie a blueprint for what it means to give everything for one's art. Consequences be damned. Had the plane crash never happened, Lynyrd Skynyrd might have ventured into new musical directions, challenging the boundaries of rock while preserving a raw authenticity at its core. Ronnie might have mended fences with old rivals, or even become a mentor figure to younger artists. We'll never know. His story, tragically brief, stands as a testament to how high and how fast a burning star can rise before meeting a sudden, violent end. Yet for all the turmoil and heartbreak, Ronnie's story is also one of fierce independence and creative fearlessness. He believed in the power of rock to connect souls, and he believed that to create something truly transcendent, one couldn't kowtow to anybody. Record label suits, teachers, or even titans of rock like Mick Jagger. Compromising stance is what made him so compelling to fans, so frightening to those who crossed him, and so unforgettable to everyone who witnessed his artistry firsthand. As the years pass, new generations continue to discover Lynyrd Skynyrd's music, finding in it a sense of raw honesty that's increasingly rare in a polished digital world. Ronnie Van Zant's voice, both literally and metaphorically, echoes through each track, reminding us that greatness often comes with a dangerous edge. He was, in many respects, the living embodiment of rock and roll's rebellious heartbeat. So, in reflecting on Ronnie's life, we see a man who never hesitated to fight for what he believed in, to test his limits, and to challenge anyone who stood in his path. We see a frontman whose very presence could raise a crowd's spirits to euphoric levels, while his fists and temper kept bandmates and foes on constant alert. We see an artist who poured his soul into his music, creating anthems that inspire fervor and devotion across the globe. And, perhaps above all, we see a human being whose own sense of destiny carried him to heights few could imagine, and who ultimately surrendered to the tragic twist of fate he had, in a way, anticipated all along. In the end, calling Ronnie Van Zant the scariest frontman in rock and roll might be shorthand for something deeper. He was unflinchingly real. Real in his beliefs, real in his flaws, real in the power he brought to the stage. And sometimes, real is the scariest thing of all. If his story teaches us anything, it's to hold fast to who we are, even if the world finds that intensity unsettling. Ronnie Van Zant did exactly that. And though his life was cut short, the echo of his roar still reverberates in every corner of rock history. Unforgettable, undeniable, and in many ways still unmatched.